Welcome everyone. It has just kicked into 1 p.m. And we are going to start our case management best practice webinar. We are still waiting for a few people that have registered to join us, but I do have a fairly full hour of content to get through today. So let's start off with a couple of housewarming items. First of all, this is a webinar, so you will not be able to speak during the webinar. However, we have got access to a Q&A button within Zoom. So if you do have a question along the way, please feel free to pop it into the Q&A. If that particular question is going to be addressed later on in the webinar, we might hold that question for just a moment. Otherwise, we will be able to answer it as we go. So if in doubt, pop your question in because we can always answer all the questions at the end as well, as there will be a little bit of time for those questions. All right, let's get started with our case management best practice. So in this webinar today, we are going to be taking you through cases. So cases is a workflow management tool in Xplan. And we're going to be talking about when you would use cases, how you would use cases, and why you would use cases within your kind of Xplan workflow journey. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the cases themselves and what is a case. I like to think of cases within Xplan as a briefcase. On one side of your briefcase is a workflow that is telling you what to do. It tells you who needs to action an item, how they need to action that item, when to action the item. It confirms what has been done so far, where the process is at, and what would happen next. So really good overview of your workflow on that one side of your briefcase. On the other side of your briefcase is your evidence. It confirms what has been done. It contains a list of outstanding Xplan activity items, a list of completed Xplan activity items, and the types of Xplan activities that you can link to are things like file notes, scenarios like risk research, a wealth solver, and your advice production, diary events, compliance fields like FSG and a fee for service. So it creates this sort of connection between the what to do and evidence-based what has been done. So we're going to start off on side one of our briefcase, which is the workflow. The workflow is looking at what to do and how to do it. So some things to think about when we are creating our cases is that a workflow is a thread. And if we think about the journey of the Xplan world, at first there were threads and then there were cases. So cases include threads, but they're better. Okay, so because they have that dual purpose of a thread workflow and case benchmark. So cases are certainly better. And when we're thinking about future development, we want to keep that in mind. Cases are the future, so we want to build for the future. Not all is lost though. We can link an existing thread to a case, so please keep watching. We're going to show you how to do that as part of today's session. So when you might use a case and a workflow case might be when you create a new client on Xplan and to link through a new client case. And that will then follow the journey of the new client to ensure that all the steps that are required have been completed. So if you haven't seen the add sort of case feature on the new client, I'm going to quickly go and demo that now for you. So let's go in to Xplan and we're going to go in and add a client from scratch. So I'm going to do an individual client and we're going to go and pop in just a bare minimum of my training client. And you'll notice here, task threads is the area that we want to get to. So I'm just going to skip over this. Of course, you would be filling all of this information in when you are creating the client. So I'm going to keep going next, get to the end of my grouping. And here on this screen, I can now activate one of my cases, and that might be my new client, example, new client thread. Here it is, new client thread. So now I can assign it to my group, I can assign it to myself, and I can create and activate that case thread. So now if I go in and view my client that I've just created on Xplan, I already have some workflow ready to go. So I can look under my tasks area and I can see straight away that my first task has been popped up. In this instance, it's assigned to me to go and do that first step. So that's where cases can help you in terms of building out your process. An example there. So when we think about creating our case thread, a case thread is simply just a group of tasks that follow your workflow journey. This can be linear or it could follow a path of decisions. So as an example, you might have a review process in-house. And so part of that process, you might have the first part is to do the pre-review work, which might lead into the next step, which is to complete the review meeting minutes. But then off the back of that, you might have a decision tree that might kick off a new thread like an ROA or an SOA, and that might have its own case thread. Or it could just follow a new task, so create an SOA or create an ROA. So when it comes to building out your case threads, think about your workflow, and you'll see here in the diagram that I've got is a workflow example diagram. One of the ways that we educate and try and train people on creating these threads within their cases is to think about your workflow from a kind of just diagram perspective. What is step one? What is step two? At the end of step one, could you go up the path or down the path? And so you're making these decisions along the way. So if you can map out your process, it makes your life a lot easier when it comes to building them within the Xplan environment. Part of what we're going to be demoing today is more around the features to consider when building out your thread, but having those base tasks are really an important step in the process and the initial step that you should take. So again, it could be step one, step two, step three, or at the end of step two, you might skip step three in some instances and go to step four. And in other instances, you might stick with step three. So really just kind of nut that out by drawing it on, in paper or utilizing some software that does some great workflow designs for you. One of the things around a workflow process and that we get asked all the time is how many tasks should my case thread have? And our motto is less is more, but make them count. And so how do you design your workflow around ensuring that you don't have too many tasks in the process that creates this administration burden? And how do you ensure that the right team members are looking after it? And how do you future-proof your workflow? So we're going to look at that in a few different areas. So the first thing I want to suggest is use checklists in lieu of multiple tasks. So a checklist is a great way to itemize things that need to be done before a task can move on to another team member or before it needs to complete and go to the next task. So again, I'm going to skip back into Xplan and I'm going to show you in the thread development area how you can do that. So remember to, well, I haven't shown you this yet, but to get into the that development area, we're going to click on the bottom icon, the three cogs. We're going to go to tasks and threads. Remembering that journey of Xplan, threads were first, cases were second. So we're still going to access it through this area, but we're going to click on cases instead. So I'm going to open an existing case that we've been working on as our example. I'm going to show you how to add a checklist to an existing task. So you will have a task in your workflow process. And to create a checklist within your thread, we're going to go to the comments area and we're going to say yes to checklists, yes to adding items, and then we use the plus icon. So it might be number 1, send email. Then you can choose if it's mandatory or optional. If it's mandatory, they're going to get this nice little star next to that checklist or that that checklist item to know that you have to do it. You can add another one. Number 2 might be to follow up client. That one might be optional because the client might have already come back before you get to that part of the checklist. So you can add as many as you like. So by adding checklists, if you think about a workflow where maybe you need to do a few things for a new client, maybe it's to send out your FSG, to create and send out an initial engagement letter, to send out an email requesting that they log into client portal and complete a fact find. You can certainly have individual tasks for each of those items, or you might like to combine them into a single task with individual checklist items that allows you to tick off as you go, completing each of those steps. And that will allow you to move, keep your task to a minimum and your task move to the next team member once that team member's completed all of the items they need. Now you'll notice up here in our description, we have some really prescriptive words. So we have a look back on our presentation. One of the things that we recommend is to use informative descriptions when it comes to what the person who gets the task can read and understand. So we like the headings of why you got this task, explaining where they're at in the process or what process they're in. So this one is the client has booked and attended the initial meeting. What you need to do is all the steps that that team member needs to complete before they hit complete on this task. So they need to complete the meeting minutes using the file note template initial meeting minutes. What happens next? Complete this task and confirm if the client is proceeding to SOA. Their outcomes include client proceeding to SOA, client not proceeding, optional extra, create a task to contact the client at a future point in time. So it's also giving them some extra instructions depending on the outcome. And we're going to have a look at outcomes shortly in today's session as well. So keeping it informative is really important, and these sorts of headings work really well in business workflow stages. The other thing that I've mentioned here is to future-proof your process for staff changes and role changes. So what I mean by that is you might have a team member called Natalie, and Natalie does this step all the time. However, Natalie might get promoted and she might become senior paraplanner. And so Natalie no longer does this task. So whilst you can assign a task to a user, to future-proof your business, it is recommended that you use dynamic roles when assigning tasks within a workflow process. That again allows you to ensure that the right person that's working on that client receives that particular task. In particular, for groups that have more than one advisor, if the task is for the advisor, you want to make sure the right advisor is selected. If you've got multiple paraplanners, you want to make sure that the right paraplanner is selected. So these dynamic roles, they sit against the client, so you can allocate who is the client's administrator, who is the client's paraplanner, who is the client's advisor, and it will then pick up the right person to activate this task against. So that's some really good tips when thinking about building out your workflow to ensure that you make these as, I guess, robust as possible, but also to reduce that admin burden for using cases long term. One of the things that we know about the case workflow process is that people will embrace this technology and want to use it if you can help them do their job by automating some of the process. So the automation out of the outcomes area is, something that we use all the time, and I highly encourage you to review the different automation features. So you can update a field on Xplan. You can send an email to a client, an advisor, a referral partner, both if you wanted to. You could go to the file notes area and load a file note template. You could go to the diary and load a diary template. You can also, we're going to look at this later, but turn on case benchmark sets, move something in an opportunity area. There's actually a large number of things you can do in the outcomes area. And in most cases, when we're looking at workflow builds, the outcome, we set an outcome activity at the end of each completion, whether it's going back to a page on Xplan or activating something. Now, an example here is that when a task to complete your meeting minutes has been completed, load the file note template. So we think about this one here. We want the team member to actually go in and complete some meeting minutes. So one of the outcomes could be to actually create a file note. So in this particular instance, we do have two outcomes, proceeding and not proceeding. We can set the same parameters at the end if we'd like to. So if the client's proceeding to SOA, we can have a look here at the outcome. So our outcome is to add a new file note, and we have set the file note here to be our initial meeting file note. So if we jump in here, we can go with our initial meeting file note quite simply. With the client not proceeding, we actually have a multi-outcome. So you can see here with our client not proceeding, we've got the same outcome, add the new file note. We've also added an entity field. So we're actually going to archive the client at this stage. So I'm going to do one more thing. So let's say the client's not proceeding now, but may proceed in the future. So I can add a third outcome, client not proceeding, but requires follow-up. Now, my primary action, I still want to add that new note and create that file note because we want to do that under any outcome. So I'm going to do the same process, come back in here to select my file note template. My entity field, I'm going to move them into a new client category that I have for these types of clients. So I'm going to jump down. There's quite a few fields to get through, so we can get there. And my category is what we call a suspect. So they're not a prospect, they're a suspect. If that's the kind of terminology you like, you might have your own choices on your site or choose from the ones on this site. You can call it whatever you like. I'm going to have a multi-action. So I'm going to activate another outcome. And this time it's going to be to add a new task. And this task is an advisor follow-up. So it is to follow up the client to touch base with them in in 6 months' time. So I don't have one necessarily for that great one now. Let's just do connect client. So this one here, you have to obviously have created a great task template, but this task is going to get to contact the client. It's set for 3 months from today as the due date. And what can happen is when the advisor or the person that has this task selects number 3, it's going to open up the file note template. It's going to set the field and set a reminder task for 6 months' time. So you can see how these outcomes can really enhance your business process by doing some of the work for you. So you don't have to think about, oh, I must also go and do this step later on. Put it into your workflow process and the team will just follow that process. So outcomes are incredibly powerful. And if you have a look at the list of outcomes you can have, it is substantial. Don't get lost in the list. Think about your key ones here are typically, to add a diary, add an email template, set a field on Xplan. They're the most common ones in use. But in your mind, when you're doing your workflow, is there anything that you're doing next that you could automate? So think about what you're doing next and see if it's in the list. In particular, one group we work with really wants to take them always back to the file notes page. So if their outcome isn't automating anything, they're always taking them to file notes so they can do some more activity for the client. And of course, save as you go. So activation criteria, when we think about a workflow process and building out our workflow, the activation criteria that sits within a case thread is one of the most important parts of that process. And activation criteria determines when the task becomes active. So it can become active based on a previous task. It can be an outcome of a previous task. It can also be a point in time. So when we have a look at the first task in any thread, your activation criteria is typically around your thread base date or a field on Xplan. So your base dates are typically your activation date. So the date that that you activate the thread is your base date. And so this task becomes active same day in most cases. Your base date might be a diary date, so what we call a fixed date. And so your base date can be your diary date, and therefore you can do so many days before the event or so many days after the event. You can see here, you can also have it change based on a field on Xplan. So you might be going through your whole workflow process, and as soon as the category changes to archived, you want a particular task to pop up, you absolutely can do that here. Or if part of the process means that the client moves from, category of prospect to gold, and you have an extra step for your gold clients, you could have this task popped up because the field changed to gold. So lots of functionality there around entity field. And case benchmarks and opportunities is another area we're going to have explore later on today in terms of case benchmarks. Opportunities we're going to have a look at our next session, which is next month, when we dive into opportunities and we look at that in more detail. We'll also be touching back on cases and linking our opportunities and cases. So please come along to that one as well. So we need to activate our particular item. So the first one, as I said, most commonly is base date. That is our activation criteria. When it comes to additional tasks within our workflow process, for example, the second task here is to send authority forms to fund managers. This one activates if the client's proceeding to SOA. So we've got this instance where task number 1 is to meet with the client, do our initial client meeting, and then we're looking at where is the client going to go to. So our activation criteria in this instance is if step 1 and the client's proceeding, we're going to move forward in our workflow process. We can skip task 2 and go straight to task 3 if we want to by just simply having task 3. Maybe this one is to contact the client in 3 months' time. And that could be if the client's not proceeding to SOA. Lots of things that you can do in terms of that activation criteria. When we're thinking about the activation criteria, I will take you back to this flow chart. Okay, so activation of this task would be outcome 1 of this task. This task here would be when this task has been completed. This task when this one's been completed, or if this one's been completed. So if you've got 2 arrows leading to activate 1, you absolutely can do that. So there is an all feature that will allow you to activate from 2 different areas. So we can activate off item 1, or number 3 has been completed. So that or functionality is a really good tool to have a task going in multiple directions and activate under different situations. Okay. You also have brackets, so you can get really complex here. We're not going to look into that today. It's probably a bit beyond the scope, but you can get fairly complex in your expressions. If in doubt, draw it out, and that's really clear. I want this activation criteria is this or this. This activation criteria is just this one. These 2 activate at the same time, but from 2 different methods. So really clear. If you do create these visual, it will help you so much in getting you to build that workflow in Xplan. The only thing that you can't do is have your arrows go the other way. So just keep in mind that it should always flow from start to end, and it's not ideal to reopen tasks where you can avoid it. Okay, so in most instances, we just tell you to keep going down. You can have loops where it's like a follow-up client, lots of those sorts of things, but not backwards, because it does become a problem and you'll get yourself into a bit of a loop issue. All right, let's keep moving on to where we were. So that is the activation criteria, really important to review as part of your build of your workflow case thread. Completed when, you will need a completed when statement to kind of wrap up. And eventually your case does need to end at some point in time. So it is important to think about your completed when statement. And to think about how your clients might end their process, because there could be exit points along the way. You might have a new client process where they get all the way through to past the initial meeting, and they might end there or keep going to SOA. Then they get to the SOA presentation meeting and they might choose to proceed or exit there. Then they go through the implementation phase and they might choose to not go on ongoing review. And so it ends there, and then they might go on to ongoing review. So these little exit points along the way, you need to consider that in terms of your completed when statement. So it might be completed after task 2 or task 7 or task 45. In terms of when we look at building out some cases, we are seeing some big cases being built for some nice, really good, robust workflow. And there's some really positive reasons why you might build one really big case as opposed to the old school way of little mini threads. And I'll sort of go through that a little bit as well today. So one suggestion might be is to have a catch-all task along the way, where regardless of your decision points, you kind of hit these milestone tasks, which allow you to kind of review and reset. And you might have your completed wins at the end of each of those. Either way, I do love a catch-all cleanup and review task at the end of a thread to help with making sure that everyone's done everything, you've signed off on the whole process, you've triple-checked all the data points. So when it comes to your workflow, consider having a cleanup and review task if appropriate, and that could be your completed when statement. So looking back at where to use it, it's up here within your view thread within your case. It is this completed when statement, so it can have multiple outcomes. You'll see in this example, the client might not proceed at stage 1. So our first expression is the client's not proceeding, or they go through all of these steps, and you'll see my little brackets encompasses that each of these items must be completed. So they go down path 1 or they go down path 2. That can be one of the most complex things that you'll do in a workflow process. So I always encourage that if you're not sure about your completed when statement, that your picture is the best place to start. That diagram is going to show you all your exit points. And the other thing that you'll note if you don't have a completed when correct is you'll have some crosses. So if I can find one with some crosses. And that is an evidence that your thread can sometimes not end. Now, most of mine are completed quite well. They have no crosses. This one's done very well. There's no crosses, but I'm just going to go and remove this completed when statement. So you can see a little cross. And you can see here, this task, okay, that has the little cross there, means it can be deleted. It means that nothing is relying on that task. That task stays open, the thread will stay open. And in most cases, if it's linear, your completed when is just when that task has been completed. So if you have a couple of crosses along the way, that's when your completed when's really important, that you close them all off and that all those tasks are done. Interestingly, if you have an open task and your completed when includes only one task, it will close off all of your thread and any outstanding items. So it is really important that you checking this, because we have had instances where a thread has been closed off because they've done that task, but not everyone had done all their tasks, and so they're all disappeared. Your completed when will shut the thread down. It's important that you don't have anything left open, hence why these little X's, if you see them in your workflow, it means that they could be open and turned off at the completion of the thread process, and you'll lose them if you haven't completed them. One of the things whenever we look at the workflow process, and we did cover this off in our task training examples last month, but I love comments to help keep your team involved. So please think about comments as your way of communicating further the kind of activity that you've been doing within your workflow. It's not the checklist items. It's not the things that you have done. It's like I followed up the client or I've left a message for the client. So you may not be able to tick off an item, but you've done some progress towards getting that item ticked off. So your comments are your progress. And what you'll notice is when we're in our task view and we've got our particular item that we're working on as part of our workflow, we can add our comments and view our comments here. So here is my workflow. I'm working on my post fact find item, and I've called and left a message for the client. What that's going to do is add and date stamp when that message was left. So I've got that evidence there, save that particular task, and now I can view my comment really easily from my task list. So my comments are there to show me what I've done as progress in my workflow. And that takes us to our task dashboard. Task Hub is a great way to view these outstanding items. So if we have a look at our dashboard, one of the things that's really cool about the Task Hub is if the task is part of a case workflow, you will see that by this little workflow icon, allowing you to access your case really quickly with a hyperlink. So it does help you identify not only what is the task, but what workflow does it belong to. And then you can jump in and view it from here. So I love these little hyperlinks that take you back into that case area, which we're going to look at today. The other thing that you can do is there are some filters available. So if you are working on particular clients, you might look at just, what is due today, and then that's going to allow you to filter down to look at just today's items. And you can, of course, sort by different things. You can sort by workflow as well. All right, so that will help, keep all of your new clients at the top or whatever your workflow filters are. So there's some really cool filter features as well. Personally, I love the setting of your different review types. I recently added this task I assigned view because I was working with setting up a whole bunch of tasks for my team, and I realized that the due dates weren't right. So rather than having to go back, find the client, I could just come in, here, was in my task list anyway, come in here and go task I assigned and jump into that person's task list and reassign those due dates. So having your different views is really helpful. So when you do have a great view that you've come up with, don't be afraid to hit save as new if you're in a particular view. If you're in your default view, you'll just be able to save it. Whatever your filters are, you can then save your filters and create yourself a view to flick between. Just absolutely love this. My team, I look at all of my team's task lists, and my daily review, which is my default, allows me to jump in and see what I need to do today. Which is really important for me to manage my task list. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention is that there is a future development that Xplan's working on, which is going to be like a workflow hub. And we have got Matt Townsend from Iris joining us on our next webinar, which is all about the opportunities area. And he may touch on this as part of Xplan's future development. So I implore you that as soon as that link comes out to register for that training session, that you do jump on and register, because it's going to kind of tie in task cases. We're going to look at opportunities, and then we're going to have a chance to hear from Matt in terms of what Xplan's doing in the future. Now, we've looked at side one, and we've looked at the workflow side of your case. There is a second side to a case, which is where your threads on steroids kind of comes in, and that's looking at evidence of what has been done. So when we're looking at evidence, we're looking at things called case benchmarks. So case benchmarks are Xplan action items recorded in certain areas. So it's your diary events, it's your file notes, it's your risk profile questionnaire, your tasks, the different areas of Xplan like FSG and fee for service, as well as all of your scenarios like your well solver, your risk research, your X tools, and your advice production wizards. So when you've got what to do, this is now the evidence of what has been done and ticking off that compliance component to your workflow process. So what's the difference between a case benchmark and a benchmark set? Well, a case benchmark is an individual required activity to be completed in Xplan. You can create as many benchmarks as you like, and there's different options within each benchmark. So whilst you might have various options of the same benchmark, we do encourage you to label them correctly. And we're going to have a look at that in just a minute. A benchmark set is a group of benchmarks required for your particular case. So you can link the first benchmark set on activation of a case. However, there is additional functionality allowing you to roll out your benchmarks over time. And that's a concept we're going to go through as part of today's session as well. It's really important to think about your benchmarks in terms of what you need to do in terms of the phases of your process as well. So let's come back to benchmarks and we'll have a look at that together. So to jump into benchmarks, we're going to search for it. I always love the search feature, so case benchmarks. And we have the initial area, we've got benchmarks, benchmark sets, and dynamic benchmark sets. Yeah, you can see it's not alphabetical, and it's in kind of what I would call the reverse order. So I would prefer to see benchmarks, then benchmark sets, then dynamic benchmarks. So I feel like that's the order you're going to go in. And I'll explain myself better now. So a benchmark is that individual activity. So if we go to add a benchmark, we need to give it a description. So it's really important the description is labeled correctly. Let's think about a benchmark for our client. It might be, we want the client to return a signed fact find. So returned, signed, fact find, right? Owner, editability, visibility. It is important that you set your visibility to your group so that everyone on your team can view your sets or your benchmarks and link them as part of the sets. So my activity type could be service offering or general activity. So again, it looks at, is it part of your day-to-day or is it based on a service offering? Compulsory or not compulsory. So if you think about things that are compulsory, you cannot complete your case unless all compulsory benchmarks have been finished. Great for compliance. If you need a copy of a signed fact find, you need their identification documents completed, you need to have sent to the FSG. By making it compulsory, it ensures that a case stays open until all those items have evidence stored in Xplan. And then you look at the benchmark type. So how are we going to identify that their signed fact find has come back from the client and is stored in Xplan? We think about where that document is stored. It's stored in the file notes area. So for this particular benchmark, it would be a file note. And to help out, we're going to set a type. So we send our our fact find is always saved as a fact find file note. And we need to have one, oops, sorry about that. Not what I wanted to do there. We need to have one fact find file note saved for this client. So I'm going to have a go at saving that fact find benchmark. And keep in mind that we're going to add lots and lots of benchmarks. So there might be the need to have a signed fact find that's, the review questionnaire or, all of the things that you're doing. There might be different versions of it. So your labeling is really important. So you'll start creating lists of file notes, of areas of Xplan, of scenario wizards, risk researcher wizards, and you'll start building up this list of benchmark items. And you'll think about it in terms of the process that your business follows. So what are the things that you need to do for a new client? What are the things you need to do if the client proceeds to SOA production? What are the things you need the client need to evidence-based if the client is proceeding to implementation? If you're going through a review process, think about all of those evidence-based areas of Xplan and start creating your individual benchmark items. Then you're going to start creating benchmark sets. And benchmark sets allows you to group up your benchmarks to have them available for selection. So one of the benchmarks might be our new client benchmark. So for all new clients, so I'm going to say own, edit, only no, visible to my group. And I'm going to start adding my benchmarks. So I would need for my client, for my new client, I need to have provided an FSG. So I'm going to add that. I need to have done a fact find wizard. So I'm going to add that. And I need them to have done their identification documents. So they're the three things at this stage that's needed for my new client set. If my client's proceeding to SOA, I might have an additional set. And so I'm going to create an SOA production benchmark set. So again, I'm going to share it with my group. And I'm going to add things like my research file note. I'm going to do my risk researcher, my wealth solver, my Xtools Plus, and I'm going to add all of my different areas of Xplan that I need to have done. And I might continue to add different benchmark sets to my production phase. Now, when it comes to the case, and let me just jump back into my presentation. I'm going to come back to that one because I want to go back to dynamic benchmarks first. There are two ways that you can set up your benchmarks. There is the one benchmark created when you create your case, but you can also have dynamic benchmarks and activate benchmarks from a task. Now, a dynamic benchmark, close this one down. A dynamic benchmark is created here in the benchmark sets area. So a dynamic benchmark is where you can set off and create automatic benchmarks at the completion of another one. So for example, my dynamic benchmark set -Jess is just for my group, and my new client set, when I've finished my or activated and completed my new client set, I want the SOA production set to be created. And then on completion of the SOA production set, I want my review set to be activated. So what this allows for is exit options. So if a client gets through the new client phase and moves into the, apologies. What this allows for is to limit the number of benchmark items that we can see to just what we're working on now. And once we've done the new client activity, it can then open up the SOA production activity quite nicely for us, but doesn't bog us down in the view of all of them in one phase. So it's a staggered release. In essence, you would do all your new clients benchmarks first anyway. So let's just display them first. Once you've done them all, then we'll open up the SOA production steps. And once you've done all of those, then we'll open up the SOA steps and maybe implementation steps and then flow on and flow on. So it helps sort of minimize the look. And I'm going to demo that right now. Just as an example, I've got saved against one of my clients. So I've got a benchmark set up for my client, Jack Steele. And so if I jump into my task, into my case, you will see here my example case benchmarks here. So if I was to select my case benchmarks, I have a list of all outstanding benchmarks visible on this screen. But it is possible that I'm only at the phase of introducing a client to our service. So having this list of outstanding benchmarks visually can be quite daunting for your team to see. So we do encourage you to consider a slow release of your benchmarks by utilizing a dynamic benchmark set. Now, when we think about our process and our thread that we've just created in our case, there could be times where the client exits. For example, they might exit before they get to SOA production. So the other thing to be mindful is you don't want the SOA production benchmarks, which might have mandatory steps in them, to display if you're not proceeding to SOA. So one of the things I do recommend is also to activate your benchmark sets on completion of a task. So I'm going to demo that now back in our case process. So we're going to jump back into our threads area, into threads and templates. And remember that new client thread that we looked at as part of our initial client meeting case? So if we wanted to activate that new client benchmark, we can go in here and select new client set. Or we could have gone with our dynamic benchmark set, which is that slow release over time. One set finishes, the next one starts. However, in most cases where you do have exits along the way, we recommend activating the first set on activation of this case. So that's the new client set, and we've activated that. When the client gets to this sort of complete meeting minutes, and if they proceed to SOA, we recommend activating the next benchmark set as part of your outcomes area. So remember, this client, if they're proceeding to SOA, it has a decision point. And so we can do, as part of multiple actions, we can set a case benchmark, and we can then do our SOA production benchmark set. So what that allows us to do is only activate that set of benchmarks in the event the client is proceeding to SOA. So whilst the benchmark sets are fabulous, and we say, create these grouped sets, think about grouping them based on the various stages of your process. And that's a really important part of building out your case workflow. So I want to come back and have a look at, now that we've understood that we can create these individual benchmarks, we can group them together into benchmark sets. How do you use them? How do they work? So I'm going to look at an example of a new client process. And some of the things we need to do for this new client is record the FSG, record their identification, complete an engagement agreement, complete the fact find wizard, obtain a signed fact find. So there's some things that we need to do. And we know that because when we go into our client and we have a look at what's outstanding for this client, we've looked at our open workflow, we can see for our example case benchmarks, he needs to have his FSG, and the FSG we're going to record as a file note. So this outstanding benchmarks helps us visualize what is outstanding for this client. Now, if you've known that you've done that step already, you can link. All right, this little link item allows you to link something that you've already done. Now, the cool thing about having your file note type set is it's going to only display file notes with the type of email. So because you've set in your benchmark that I know that my FSG is always sent on email, that's always going to be the type, it adds the filter for us, which is really cool. We can just link our file note, super simple, and that's now done. And we need to do the fact find wizard. So again, if we've done a wizard, we can link it here. Otherwise, we can go and add a new item, so the little plus icon, and we can go in and add a fact find. The other thing you can do, especially with fact-finding wizards and advice wizards and your well solvers and your risk researchers, is you can do it at the time that you're actually doing the activity. Just going to save you a couple of minutes, which is great. So let's say as part of my process, I'm going to create a fact find for Jack Steele. What I can do is I can call this, and I'm just going to call it just test for now. And I'm going to link it to my case benchmark, and I'm going to create my scenario that's already linked. And I'm going to jump into my scenario. I'm going to go through a couple of pages of my scenario, but I don't get to the end. All right, so I'm just going to hit save and exit. So what that's done for me in terms of that process, and if I go back into my view of his workflow case, and I have a look at his case benchmarks, what it's going to tell me is my fact find. So I'm going to go into this view. My fact find wizard is still incomplete, but I have linked it. All right. So I've got a connection to my wizard, but it's showing as incomplete because I haven't gone to the end. So one of the things with your wizards is you do need to get all the way to the end. All right. So you need to jump to appendix. I need to hit next in this instance. On completion of the wizard, it completes that phase of your case benchmark. So now that I've done that step, I want to show you how it now marks as complete. This time I'm going to click on the eye to take me straight into the complete and incomplete benchmarks, and I can now see what's been completed. All right. So as a worker, I'm going to probably want to look at this sort of activity view to see the completed and the incompleted areas. These are the benchmarks that have been set by my team. I can also add non-benchmark activities. So you've got kind of adding and linking, creating new items in both of these environments. But in essence, by telling your team what they need to do, identification document, they can link activity they've done in Xplan, or they can do that activity and it automatically links. So here is my, AML attached, terrible typing. And then I go in here and I upload my AML document. So I'm doing my work and ticking off that I've done that activity. So it's now marked as complete. So think about your case benchmarks, that evidence. You can do the evidence inside the area that you're doing the work or from here. So either way. So a couple other file notes examples is the risk tolerance questionnaire, which is a fact find, which is a file note as well. So again, if I jump back into Jack Steele, and the other way to complete your activity, I'm going to jump into the file notes. I'm going to add a file note. Here is my RPQ. And here I'm going to link it to my case benchmark. So I do need to make sure that I've got my type and my subtype and all those sorts of things there, but I can also link here through the workflow link. So think about your process. What is it that you need to evidence-based for compliance, for ensuring that you meet your business requirements, to service your clients, all those things, and start creating these sets, and then think about how you're going to activate each set. Does it all get kicked off at once, or is it a staged, staggered approach to releasing those benchmarks? Do you want to release them based on one set finishes, the next one starts, and therefore use dynamic benchmarks? Or do you want to have activation at the end of particular tasks, and therefore you can control which ones open and close? Now, when it comes to creating and activating your case, and I'm very conscious of time, there are ways that you can auto activate. I'm not going to demo these because we haven't got much time, but through a diary event can link to a case. So if you're creating a new meeting or a review meeting, you can auto activate a case that has your benchmark items and your workflow items. So they book the meeting and it auto kicks off those cases. You can do it through that file note area we just looked at, where we were linking a file note to a case. You can also activate a case at the back of a file note. So in this example, if the client has called to request a withdrawal from their super fund, you could write the file note and activate the withdrawal process case that you've created through that workflow output. When you're looking at cases to activate in bulk, we recommend the scheduler area. For example, if you've got clients coming up for a review and you have a review workflow process, you could use Scheduler with a two-step schedule. Step 1, find clients due next month. Step 2, activate the review case. And you could kick that off on the start of each month, so it automatically rolls out the new cases each month for all of your review clients. And of course, that comes with all the activity that you need to do, plus allowing you to benchmark and making sure that you set that activity that you've done in Xplan, and you can tick off each review's been done correctly and completely. Now, I did mention at the start of the session that if you haven't yet looked at cases, and if you've perhaps built everything as threads, not all is lost. You can link an existing thread to a case. So I'm going to quickly demo that for you. And while I'm demoing that, I want to say that if you haven't looked at cases and all of your workflow is threads, and you haven't looked at your threads in a while, it may be time to start thinking about, is your thread process still the most appropriate thread? Given the enhancements over the last 12 months around thread checklists, that we are seeing more and more people reduce the number of tasks in their thread. We're also seeing a lot more people enhance their automation and activity off the back of them. So if your threads could use a bit of an uplift, then now's the time maybe to create them as cases and start them again. But if your threads are really good and you just want to link them to a case and you can use case benchmarks, you absolutely can. Once you go into the add case area, there is the ability to link thread templates. So you can go in and link them and have them tick off and start automatically when your case is activated. So it's not all lost, but we do recommend in most cases that you do start from scratch and you build your threads inside your case itself. Now's the time to start popping in those questions, guys, if you do have any questions about the process. But just, I guess, as some of the, kind of to tie it all together, your case, your workflow case is your combination of your thread process and your evidence-based approach using case benchmarks. The ability to visualize and see your case, to see what tasks have been done, what benchmarks have been set, is all enhanced through that view screen. And I'll just quickly show you again through your workflow. Again, if you want to view where things are at, you click on your case and you get this overview of your case, allowing you to see what tasks are there, what benchmarks are outstanding, then delve further into your benchmarks to see the completed and incompleted ones. So this view is really, really cool in terms of what you can do within your workflow now, linking and tying. So tasks are so powerful in Xplan. They're visually a lot better, they're robust, they're easy to use and automate a lot of the process for you. Cases helps join things together to create your workflow. And next month, we're going to touch on how to visualize your pipeline and your leads, and how opportunities can help you with your visual approach to your work over time, and how your journey of your client process and your review process and your implementation process can all flow together, and how cases can also enhance your opportunities area and automate cases off opportunities and push opportunities via cases. So we're going to wrap it all up next webinar when we talk about opportunities. And it is incredibly powerful tool to kind of use within your system because of the visuals that are now available. And we are very honored that Matt Townsend's going to come along to that session. So make sure you register to get the opportunity to ask Matt a question as part of that session. And our last sort of Xplan series that we're running will be on file notes. So our July session will be our file notes, where we're going to have a deep dive into utilizing file notes in ways that perhaps you haven't even thought of, and how you can really maximize your efficiencies, your automation, and the power of file notes within Xplan. So now's the time. I will be sticking around for the next couple of minutes as you pop a question in. We haven't had any all the way, so hopefully that means that we've been able to cover up on the questions that you perhaps had in this area, and you're all eager now to go away and have a quick look at cases yourself and start building them. However, remember that Practice Dynamics is here to help you. So if you do try and build something yourself, or if you'd like us to work with you on the case development, please reach out and engage with us. I will now welcome any questions, pop them into the Q&A. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, guys, and thank you very much for attending today's session.